We will begin with technical session 5, building on the REC's 2020 successes, and Chip Berry is our presenter. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mimi. Share. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Mimi. My name is Chip Berry, and I'm the team lead, or you can say program manager, for the residential demand program at EIA. I want to start off with just a couple words of thanks. First of all, to the REC's team, Carolyn Hronis, who is now the survey manager for REC's, which was my old job. Special thanks to her for carrying forward. We're about halfway through releasing results from the 2020 REC's, and so far it's been pretty successful. So I want to thank her and the team. It's been a great experience so far. And then also just to in advance thank Mimi and Pat. We've already engaged in some really thoughtful conversations about this. So very much looking forward to hearing more of what they have to say and what the committee has to say. So and with that in mind, I know they do have a lot to say. So I have 29 slides, but I'm gonna rush through a few of them because this is less about what I have to say and more what we want to hear from you all. Okay. All right. So today I'm going to. We lose the slides?
Yes.
Let's do it this way. So you can't see them anymore?
No.
Shoot. Okay, hold on. Getting it back here.
There it comes.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay. Oh, come on. Okay, here we go. So from the committee today, we as I mentioned, we're in the middle of releasing results from the 2020 REC's. We've done all the data collection. We've released first half of the results. So from the committee today, we're looking for first of all, general reaction to the methods and the results from the 2020 REC's. But we're considering 2020 REC's as a success, okay? And based on those successes, how can we leverage that to build in new initiatives for the program? And the three initiatives I'd like for us to focus on today center around community level estimation, potential for building on the multifamily building study pilot that we did last year, and then also expanding the REC's to cover residential housing units in Puerto Rico. A little bit of history about REC's for perhaps the newly initiated. The REC's, the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, has been around really since the inception of EIA in the mid to late 70s. The 2020 was the 15th time we had done it. REC's is an interesting study. It's very comprehensive, and it's interesting because it's actually done in 3 parts. It's not just a survey. We start with a household survey that's based on a representative sample around the U.S. of housing units, and it's an address-based sample. But we don't stop there. We then, subsequent to the household survey, we go to energy suppliers, utilities, and such, and collect the energy bills for the households who respond to the household survey. And then the third phase of REC's is what we call the in-use modeling estimation program. And that's where we leverage the household survey responses and the bills we collect to produce estimates of disaggregated in-use. So not just what the average electricity consumption is, but also how much of that electricity is being used for air conditioning and televisions and such. Okay, we'd like to consider ourselves a little bit innovative for 2 reasons I've pointed out here. One is our use of self-administered, pure use of self-administered questionnaires for the 2020 REC's. That's a little bit unique in the federal statistical system, and that's mostly what I'm going to focus on today. And then our use of administrative and other data sources, primarily for the in-use modeling, but also in the frame and sample design, we do use administrative records for that. Okay. But I'm going to start off by focusing on a little bit of recent history on how we transitioned the RECs from a purely in-person CAPI survey, the household survey, to self-administered web and paper instruments. Okay. So about 10 years ago, the Committee on RECs and CBECs, and as part of that report, there were 17 recommendations for RECs. We really took to heart was to explore alternative modes of data collection. Okay, so with that report in hand, we embarked on a series. We planned a series of pilots, 3 pilots to test the feasibility of using self-administered instruments for the RECs household survey. We started with a study in collaboration with the University of Maryland, followed that up with a cities pilot in 5 cities across the U.S., and then subsequent to that, took that pilot to the national level, did a national level pilot. And throughout that piloting process, I will credit IMG Crown and RTI with partnering us in a contractual sense for these pilot studies for the cities and the national pilot studies, and as part of the monitoring the data collection and the quality of the data, we knew that we had to, in addition to looking at response rates, right? In federal surveys, there's been an obsession on response rates, right? That we had to look at other metrics because we knew we weren't going to get that 80% threshold, that sort of O&B kind of hints that you need to get in a survey. Okay, we knew in a self-administered environment we were not going to get anywhere close to 80%. Okay, so that means we turn to focusing on other metrics. And here's an example of one of those metrics we tracked really on about a daily basis during the pilots. And here we see in blue, these are shares, raw, unweighted shares of the national pilot respondents by some pretty broad income bins. And that's in comparison to really high quality estimates, weighted estimates from ACS. And you can see even unweighted, our RECs national pilot respondents, at least in terms of income, were fairly representative across those 3 levels. And we looked at other measures, housing type, age of the home, main heating fuel, and we could see that our respondents were fairly representative of the population that we're studying. Okay. So jump through all that pilot experience, and at the end, what we came out with was that web and mail or paper or self-administered modes were viable options for RECs. Okay, so with this sort of decision in hand, we began to ask ourselves, okay, well, how do we leverage these new modes of collection, these much more cost-efficient modes of collection? Okay, and our number one priority was clearly that we needed to expand the sample to be able to produce estimates in all 50 states. Okay, and that is something we had heard throughout. I've heard it about 13, 14 years here at EIA. Prior to the 2020 RECs, was like, really, we'd like 50 state estimates. Okay, can you get that for us? But in addition to 50 state estimates, a much larger sample, we could produce more precise estimates of other key subpopulations. And I give an example here, and that's like fuel oil consuming households in the Northeast. Whereas before, we would have estimates of fuel oil consuming households in the Northeast. Now we could specifically target those households in our design. Okay, and much more than just sort of an organic estimation, you could say. And then also with the larger sample, we can reveal more about emerging topics. And here, the example I give is being able to say more about households who have electric vehicles. Okay. During the sample design, because we are initially targeting between about 18 and 20,000 completes, we could have a much more, because we weren't using in-person interviews, we could have a much more, or we could have really an unclustered sample. That's not exactly true. We're clustered in the sense that we had states as a cluster, right? A sampling cluster. But we didn't have to cluster anything more granular geographically because we didn't have to send interviewers out. Okay, so we had a much more efficient sample. We could do more with it, and this slide just shows examples of how we were able to do more with that sample. In previous RECs, our statistical targets in terms of RSEs were just average site consumption at the national census and division level. for the 2020 RECs, we were able to add precise precision level targets for all 50 states, and not just overall site consumption, but also for electricity, natural gas, and I mentioned fuel oil. Okay. All right. So in the end, with 2020 RECs, we ended up with about 18,500 completes. That is more than triple the size of the 2015 RECs. And the sample was allocated across geographies, states, obviously, but also specifically allocated for specific housing characteristic type, like housing type or age of home, things like that. Okay. In terms of estimating how much sample we would need to achieve our targets in each state, we use ACS data, the ACS data yield rates. So we just didn't assume, say, a 40% response across all states. We had differential response, okay, which basically led to, say, in New York City or DC, where historically response rates are lower, we were able to allocate a higher starting sample to those areas than, say, like Iowa and Minnesota, where households are better at responding to surveys, okay? We implemented a three-phase responsive design. In the end, we ended up with an overall weighted response of 38%. Of course, that varied across states. But the key here, though, despite this lower response rate than historically what we achieved with RECs, that the representativeness, again, we were able to track on a daily basis, was very similar to the pilot studies. Okay, on most metrics. There were some subpopulations, for example, Hispanic households responded at a lower rate than other types of households. Okay. All right. So I mentioned we have already produced some estimates from the 2020 RECs, about half the estimates. So all the results from the household survey are out there, almost all the results. We still need to produce some square footage estimates. The second half, which is we call the consumption and expenditures data, or C&E, will be coming out in spring. And that necessarily lags because that collection of billing data necessarily lags from the household survey. Okay. Okay, so some results from the 2020 RECs. And I'll start with a really hot topic, and that's electrification. And this is a map we put out in a Today in Energy article a couple of months ago. And here we see one quarter of how our estimate is about a quarter of households are all electric. And when we talk about all electric, we're talking about a household that doesn't use natural gas, propane, fuel oil, or wood. Okay, strictly all electric. Florida and Hawaii, not surprisingly, the highest shares of households that are all electric. And maybe a little bit surprising, you know, if you don't live in California, I think of only about 8%. Our estimate is only 8% of households are electric. And you'll notice here, and this is pertinent maybe for looking at the future of RECs, there are two states that are grayed out. And they're grayed out because we weren't able to release an official estimate of the percent of homes that are electrified in those states because we didn't have the sample. Not the overall sample, but there were just not enough homes in our responding sample who reported essentially being all electric. Okay, so maybe hints at a little bit of still the limitation of a 50-state program. Okay, and this is sort of the flip side, helps explain that prior map I showed. And these are homes that report using natural gas for cooking. Here you can see California, 70% of homes use natural gas, okay, for cooking. And those prior to maps I showed come directly from a series of state level tables. And here you can see an example of that table. And we have a column there for the total number and the share of homes that are all electric. Okay, a few more maps of interesting highlights from the 2020 RECs. This is about the types of bulbs that are used in homes, and our estimate from the 2020 RECs is that we were up to nearly half of homes reporting mostly or all LEDs, and that is up from just 4% in 2015. So fairly rapid change here in the residential sector. Perhaps you might consider this what I maybe consider a rapid change. When I first started at EIA in the first few years, one of the big topics was DVRs and all the homes having DVRs, and that as they were originally engineered, a DVR was like having another refrigerator in your house, right? Well, now DVRs are disappearing in favor of streaming services. and not just DVRs, but cable boxes themselves, either with or without. I actually just got rid of mine, finally got rid of mine 2 months ago. I thought I could hold off by cutting the cord, but it's college football season, so I had to get Fubo. I got to watch Penn State football. So now I'm in the streaming services category here. But I estimate I'm going to save about 3% on my electric bill because I got rid of those cable boxes. Okay. And perhaps this is something, the last 2 slides were sort of what you might consider like fairly rapid change or differences in the residential sector. Here, air conditioning, we see something that it isn't changing quite as much. Roughly speaking, just about everyone who would want air conditioning has air conditioning, about 90% of the homes. Really only homes along the West Coast and the more temperate climates along the West Coast of California, and particularly maybe some older homes on the West Coast in the marine area just do not have air conditioning now. Okay. All right. Another very interesting topic that's actually gotten a lot of interest in REX is now our data series on energy and security. And this is our own unique definition of energy and security. And it's based on a series of questions that I've actually been on the REX for several years, for several iterations. And here we see in 2020, we recorded a decrease in the percentage of homes reporting energy insecurity. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be due to moratoria, state level moratoria on disconnection and shutoffs. It was also a little bit warmer in 2020. And there could be other reasons. Okay. But this is an interesting series that's gotten a lot of interest. Okay. Prior mentioned being able to produce estimates for what you might call emerging subpopulations. And we do have some information on EVs, including our households with EVs reporting, 3/4 of them reporting that they do some charging of their EV at home. Now, what's interesting on the flip side, there's 1/4 of them who report not charging at all at home. Okay. And this is just to foreshadow the data that's just to come. This is a graph from the 2015 REX showing our in-use breakouts for electricity. And we intend to produce a very similar graph. And again, one thing that's missing here that you don't see is a breakout of EV charging. And I think we fully intend to produce an estimate of home EV charging. And that'll be in early spring. Okay, so 2020 so far, a success. We did webmail, all right. ESS, we achieved a 93% response rate, and that the energy supplier survey is done under mandatory authority. But we maintain our response rate for the ESS, and Leidos, and I give credit, Leidos and Westat were our partners in that collection. I haven't mentioned it yet, but we navigated COVID. One of our goals of transitioning to web and mail was that it would be a much more resilient survey, resilient platform, and certainly that proved itself during COVID. We didn't have to pull interviewers out of the field. There were really no impacts from COVID on our data collection. We did the 50-state REX. We produced another in the series of energy and security data. We did a multifamily building study pilot. Okay, we know there's interest there, and we are also expanding our data sharing agreements with other federal agencies. All right, so where do we go from here? We've heard from stakeholders over the years, but also recent legislation that give hints to where, actually more than just hints, it directly tells us what we should be doing with the program, and that's what I'd like to focus on today. And that's in the area of community level estimation, a multifamily building study, and then expanding to Puerto Rico. But there are other areas, as I'll show here in a few slides, that are mentioned in not only the bipartisan infrastructure law, but also the recent IRA. That maybe give hints to where we may expand the program. Okay. Over the years, from stakeholders, the energy insecurity, energy justice, energy burden is a big topic. And I will note that Ross Bell on our team was the opening presenter at the equity panel at ACEEE back in August. So credit to him. And that's the second time we've been able to open the equity session. That's an honor for us. There's also talk of the nexus between health and safety and energy. A lot about Puerto Rico and outlying areas. We get requests or questions from our data users all the time asking, do you have data for a specific city or even for a zip code or sometimes my house? interest in the multifamily building, and also rural areas. And then electrification is a huge topic now. Okay. I'll breeze through these, but I just kind of have highlighted some language that's in the BIL. And I'll note that over these next two slides, you'll see some things that we've already accomplished. We've increased the scope and the frequency. We've implemented new data collection methods in the form of web and mail. We've reduced the burden on our respondents. Okay, but there's some things that where there's a potential for us to address, and that's in community level or local area estimation, revealing more either during visualization through visualization perhaps, or other methods about different demographic subpopulations. And then just another slide from the BIL. And again, these are some areas where we've actually already accomplished these things. Specific mission to producing estimates by state. We've done that. Here's multifamily building. We've started on that. There's no official estimation. And then another interesting is revealing more about electric service capacity. If you think about everyone buying EVs in the next 20, 30 years, what's the capacity of a home's electric panel to be able to accommodate that? Okay, so those three questions, I've already covered that here. With regard to community level estimation, what collection efforts might support a community level or small area estimation program? What prior and ongoing efforts and collaborations might support this program? So two areas. What can we do? We have a nice platform with REX. Can we use that to expand our sample maybe for small areas or cities or counties or something? And then what partnerships maybe we pursue? In terms of the multifamily building, felt the pilot was relatively successful. We learned a lot. How can we build on that? And continue to interact with our stakeholders to produce official estimates for partners and mixed use, for apartments and mixed use buildings. And then what opportunities, risks, and constraints are inherent in studying household energy use in Puerto Rico? It's a very relevant topic right now, right this day. And then what collaborations might be necessary. And then I leave it open. There are a world of possibilities for us, a new initiative to REX. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Mimi and Pat in the committee on our recent successes and the future of REX. Thank you.
Mimi, you're on mute.
I didn't do that. Sorry. So thank you very much, Chip. Lots going on in the REX. I'll turn it to Pat for comments.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Chip. That was a nice summary of the REX. And thanks also for meeting with us a couple of times. Thanks, Meg, for these arrangements. And let me see if we, and let me know if you're seeing my screen.
We do. Yep,
Okay.
It looks great.
Great. Okay, thanks. So, let's see, I'll make a few comments about the REX, but I'm going to leave most of that to Mimi because she has a nice summary and some good comments coming up. Some brief suggestions for the next iteration, and then I'll spend most of the time on the responses to questions 1 and 3. So here, there are many successes in the REX, and I'm just going to say very briefly, then go on because Mimi will talk about this, but the self-administered aspect of it, predicting response, allowing you to get the required sample sizes that you need, very successful there. And I really like the flexibility of the survey design, meaning the questionnaire and the data collection approach. But again, I'll leave this in the slide deck and move on. The next iteration of REX. Let me see if I can just get this out of my way here. Okay, yes, okay. Frequency, I think as soon as it's feasible. So I realize it's budget, planning, everything else, but you've got momentum from this successful version of REX. And the sooner you get back out and collect the data, the more relevant it's going to be with your data users. The design, I'd say start with the current 2020 REX. The modes worked well. Increase sample size. Well, again, that depends upon the goals and the budget, and I'll get to that a little more. More flexibility in the sampling and the phases, if there's something that you have in mind, have been very successful so far. The questionnaire, can you insert test questions on newly emerging energy topics? I'm sure there are many things that the industry wants to know. Finally, if you could conduct the RECs in periods like 2 years apart or something like this in the future, then periodic change becomes more easier to estimate, and it becomes a very interesting topic to people. Now, I won't spend any time on this slide. Should you consider a rotating panel design? Well, I know Janice talked about rotating panels in the CPEX last year, and I'm always very happy to talk about rotating panel designs, one of my favorite topics. But I'll leave this in the slide deck, so we can get to the questions. Okay, I won't bother reading this again because Chip just did. But community level estimation. Right? Yes, I think you want to consider it and work towards it. Will that make it any easier? Well, first of all, I'm going to say a few words during this about the 2020 post-enumeration survey that followed the 2020 census. What was the biggest complaint that we got from data users and many others? We didn't have any results for counties, cities and towns, neighborhoods. We had no results for states crossed with other classifications that are of interest to them. In this case, it would be race, Hispanic origin, age groups. So people want these lower levels, and that's exactly what Chip mentioned a second ago. One of the reasons we didn't produce these in this post-enumeration survey, well, it has to do with the sample size. We had approximately 160,000 housing units, and that size didn't support lower level estimates. If we apply direct sample weighted estimates, the sample size is too small to go to very low. Some people say, well, how about the ACS? They provide estimates even down to the block level. Why can't you do something that the ACS does? Well, let's take a look at the numbers. This will be instructive because the RECs is more similar in some ways to the post-enumeration survey that we just conducted in its size. The purpose, well, we know what this is, coverage of the census for the PES. I think most of you are familiar with the ACS. It has many household and person items it estimates. And RECs, of course, we know what that attempts to cover. Level of estimation. The PES in 2020 released estimates for the nation, the states, major demographic groups, but not cross-classifications in these, otherwise not smaller domains. The American Community Survey, they cover areas over 65,000 every year. So every year you get the 1 year estimates. Areas under 65,000, we produce estimates for them as well. Small communities, any size, even down to block group levels. However, let's look at the sample size. For PES, about 160,000. The American Community Survey, they have 3.5 million households per year in their sample. So if you're a small community, smaller than the 65,000, we're talking 17.5 million housing units. That's over 100 times the size of the PES. So sample size is what's very relevant here. And you can see that PES reminds you more of what's, the scope, not the scope, but the size of the RECs. So one thing you could do, or you can consider, increasing sample size. By how much? We know that there are diminishing returns as you increase the sample size with respect to the standard errors and the coefficients of variation. And of course, budget, which you may have less control over, of course. Small area estimation. I won't say much about this directly here. There are experts on our panel, there are experts at EIA, and experts that know more than I do, but one of the things is applying some composite type of estimator, like a Fay-Harriott type of estimator. Typically, it pulls towards the modeled estimate according to how much variance there is in the model and how much variance there is in the direct estimate. And the accuracy depends very heavily on whether the model is correct. Further, we have to estimate the precision of the model if we're going to provide estimates of your estimate of the composite estimate or the small area estimate. So I'll just say a few words about a specific synthetic estimator, a model-based estimator that we used in the survey that I mentioned. In this survey, we produce estimates of the we use the sample itself to produce estimates of the model parameters. And then the model is applied to every person in every housing unit. You can think of like unit level types of models. And the reason for this, it goes back, I think, this is what I believe, it goes back to the PES history. Back in the 1990s and before that, up to 2000, we were planning, we had to be ready in case we used this post-enumeration survey to adjust the census, in which case we had to do it for every block in the country because that's what's required for redistricting. But one of the advantages that PES has is it requires only a few models in its estimation. Of course, REX has many characteristics that you have to estimate, in which case you'd have many models to check and to analyze and model well. So here are several options. Well, if you use synthetic estimation, as I've mentioned, I'm not recommending that you do, by the way. You can include variables in the model for every estimate. However, of course, this limits how many estimates you'd have. Otherwise, you have too many variables. There's too much variability in the composite or small area estimate. If not, then you're susceptible to synthetic or model bias. Then you have to estimate that bias well if you're going to provide good estimates of the variability of your estimates. And that's something that's more difficult. We tried that in 2010, and I think our estimates of the bias and therefore the mean squared error was not as good as we would have liked. Okay, so some brief suggestions here. Yes, try it at the next iteration. Try producing some estimates at lower levels, but don't try to do everything the first time. You have too much that you're trying to do. Perhaps start with counties, maybe even the large counties. That's what we did in 2010. We provided estimates from the post-enumeration survey only for the larger counties in the country, in the larger places, the larger cities and towns. Start with only a small set of the most important variables. Finally, don't overpromise. We know that data users will never turn down a new estimate, but if you pull back, they hate it. So let's get to the other question, Puerto Rico and the outlying areas. So first of all, the frame. In your current REX, you've used a computerized delivery sequence file from the Postal Service. And there are differences in the estimates in Puerto Rico. And you may be aware of that, just as an example of the urbanization field. Sometimes it comes before the city, sometimes it comes before the street. And there's not a whole lot of consistency in different areas. Sometimes addresses, you could have a cul-de-sac with this one address, and it represents all of the different housing units there, and they might have A, B, C, or whatever like this. Other concerns with the drop point addresses, which are important to remove for your survey. There is supplemental information on Puerto Rico, which is perhaps a plus, depending upon what you can use. Otherwise, there's the Puerto Rico Community Survey. Sampling. Should you oversample? I think that's a good idea. That's what we do in a lot of our surveys, and I'm guessing that you did in the REX. Otherwise, oversample the small states. In Puerto Rico being smaller in size than most of the states, that's not the consideration there. Data collection modes. I like the current REX with the internet and the mail. However, in Puerto Rico, there are a higher percent of areas with no internet access right now, currently. Questions about the reliability of the mail in Puerto Rico as well. Perhaps one advantage is that because of the weather, there may be more consistency of energy use across the year. If you can take advantage of that, it may help. Questionnaire itself, I'm presuming you'd have something in Spanish and in English. It's very important to use Spanish terms that are recognized clearly in Puerto Rico. There are differences in idioms and other terms up and down, North and South America. When constructing the questionnaires, so they should be passed by Spanish-speaking Puerto Ricans, not just any Spanish speakers. And of course, you'd want to pre-test it. I'm sure you would want to do that. Administrative records. I can't speak for EIA and other agencies, but I can't even speak for sure about the Census Bureau. But we know a lot about administrative records in the stateside and less about Puerto Rico. So that may be something to consider. I don't know. Energy use as a topic. Well, we've had a lot of traumatic events in Puerto Rico in the last 5 years or so. Hurricanes before and even this week, an earthquake. So accessibility to energy, always an important topic, is even of greater interest in Puerto Rico. On the other hand, on the downside, the reaction to these events has made accessibility to energy a very sensitive topic there. My friends in Puerto Rico, they say in the stateside part, they talk about defunding the police. There they joke about defunding the energy suppliers. That's some of the concerns down there. Anyways, would these attitudes affect the level of response, at least to a question like this, and its accuracy? Outlying territories, just briefly, I'd suggest work on Puerto Rico first. Puerto Rico is simpler in many ways than the outlying territories. There are many differences in the other territories, plus the distance. It's not so hard to hop on a plane to Puerto Rico. It's a lot further away to 3 of the 4 outlying territories. Also, the outlying territories, they have a census every 10 years, but they don't have an analogous territory community survey. So you'd have information that's not updated every 10 years. I'm sorry, not updated every year, but only once every 10 years. So thanks. Let me turn it over to Mimi.
Thanks a lot, Pat. It's great information. And let me get my slides up. Got that. So lots of good news. I've mentioned a couple of things. Chip had a little bit longer list. So the 50 state RECs is extremely welcome to RECs users, and I'll say that for something I'm in the middle of, I've started using that 50 state RECs for a very small state that happily had, 150-ish data points. That was nice to see. Obviously, the non-response bias assessment is extremely important as we see response rates drop, and this is an issue we're all dealing with across the industry. So always interested in exactly how we're assessing that and what we're doing about it. And clearly, the ability to go to a mostly unclustered online sample has been extremely effective, and that's quite valuable. I would say that the mandate to start doing more at the community level is effectively going to be changing the RECs function from only sampling and estimation, which has not exactly been trivial, to adding to that more of a modeling component. We're already doing that with the end-use energy breakout, but trying to bring the pieces together between RECs and ACS to develop small area estimates really creates requires a different level of expertise and ability to assess quality of models, and Pat already alluded to that. So the accuracy assessment of the models themselves becomes increasingly important. And then, as someone who's been trying to use that 50 state RECs, it occurred to me that it would be nice if there are ways to facilitate users making use of that microdata. So when I'm trying to calculate standard errors, do I actually need to use the 60 replicate weights and do the jackknife estimate, which I'm guessing most users are not going to be bothering with? Or can I do something simpler and you give me an overall state design effect that isn't perfect, but at least gives me some idea of what's going on there? Could EIA even produce an online calculator where people could query the data and you would do the right things with it? So we have been running the residential appliance saturation survey in California for several iterations. For the 2019 RAS, we do have an online query tool. It's not producing standard errors. We have another piece of work currently in progress, the California RAS, that is going to allow people to do slicing and dicing as they would like, and we will also be offering them standard errors with that. They will be approximate, of course, because otherwise you never get anything back when you put your query in. But those are things to think about. That's a 40,000 household sample responding on that one. 8% response rate, is that okay? And if it's not, what on earth would we do about it? So I just went back so we could all say, oh, the good old days. This is the 1993 REX methodology report and what the assigned units were, but more importantly, what were the response rates starting back in 1978 and up through 1993. So we were seeing some tailing off by 1993, but we were still above 80%. And of course, now we feel pretty excited to get 38% out of, and you know, compared to other things in progress, that is good. I don't want to belittle what it takes to get to that. But obviously, at 80%, we could have very high confidence that we weren't being much affected by non-response bias. And at 38%, we have to worry a lot more about that. So, and obviously, EIA has been doing that. I looked at the what was in the methodology report about the non-response bias assessment. And it says, well, the unit response rates varied across subgroups, which we would expect. There were some statistically significant differences for some characteristics, which we would expect, but the differences were small. Not sure what we mean by that, so it would be nice to know at least what that means. There was a note that the key estimates were statistically similar to ACS and the AHS. I'll just say that statistically similar is a phrase that I try to banish from our technical reports because I don't think it really means what people think it means. Definitely used weighting adjustments to deal with the non-response adjustments. And then, of course, there was the recommendation that users should use those relative standard errors to figure out if two estimates were statistically significantly different. And that's what led me thinking about, could you help the users have access to reasonable standard errors for those issues? So thinking about that, I'm not sure how far you're going with control totals related to the ACS and the AHS and whether there might be more that could be done there. And
Mimi, I think you froze. There you are.
am I the one who's fading out? I'm seeing other people fade out.
Yeah, just for a moment there.
Okay. So basically just concerned that when we say things are not statistically different, does that really just mean we don't have enough power in our test? And that one estimate is just too fuzzy to figure out whether there's bias there or not. So this was a picture that Chip provided. It's quite dramatic to go from 4% saturation 5 years ago to 47% in 2020. Probably the biggest change of anything I think we've seen on the REX in that kind of time frame. And it's not unreasonable, at least directionally, we know that LEDs are taking over, and it's a problem for energy efficiency programs all over the country. But I do wonder a little bit exactly how good this comparison is, because when I look at the survey, I see that the lighting questions of what portion of the light bulbs in your home are these different kinds of bulbs. It says they've been changed since 2015, but I can't find the 2015 survey online. And I'm also wondering if somebody is first shown this picture, which is supposed to tell them that's an LED and not an incandescent, do they recognize that that's an LED and not an incandescent? So a little bit of question there on how well we know what's going on with lighting. Multifamily building study. So Chip mentioned it happened. Didn't tell you a lot about it. So I put in a little bit from the report, which I will not claim to have read in huge detail. But the purpose there was to assess the feasibility of collecting data on energy consumption and characteristics of residential buildings such as apartments, condos, co-ops. And so it was targeted to multifamily and mixed use that were at least 50% residential and 5+ units. And a big effort there was identifying and interviewing the people who were most knowledgeable about the building's energy-related characteristics and energy, with an overall response rate of 31%, close to what the household survey got, which is a nice result. Just some reminders about the challenges we have with multifamily buildings. So, the building includes the individual housing units. It includes common areas and what I'll call service areas, such as mechanical rooms that residents don't go into, but they are spaces that are part of the building and the energy plant. And often they also include some commercial businesses. And so different pieces of information are best provided by the housing occupant, by the building owner or manager, and then by the energy suppliers. And the energy suppliers serve both individual occupants and the common space, the manager. So that common areas are typically on one person's account, individual units on another. These buildings account for about 18% of households. And as was described in the study itself, anything you might do to try to list these things is going to be messy. So what the study did accomplish, one thing I liked is that there was a lot of consultation with different kinds of experts in multifamily housing, including housing authorities. How do you actually get access to these folks? Working out of the basic methods, how do you identify the listings? How do you develop a measure of size? Identify contacts? What are effective outreach and fielding methods? And these were tested out in 4 locations, and lessons learned were identified, which I'm not going to summarize. So in terms of building on this for estimation, obviously you want to use all the lessons learned from those pilots. But then the next steps that I'm thinking about, well, how do we assess the quality of the data? How do we assess the response bias and the non-response bias compared to other sources? We don't have a lot of other sources on multifamily buildings, and this little piece that's always been kind of missing. As far as I could tell, you didn't yet test out the energy supplier component of the data collection. And we know that getting all the accounts together for a multi-customer building is difficult. We do have lots of experience of that from CBEX, and CBEX has developed some methods, but I don't think those CBEX methods have particularly paid attention to this difference between tenant space and common area, because that hasn't been quite so much of an issue for CBEX. So then the next thing is how do you put all the pieces together between the household survey and the multifamily building survey? And probably given this some thought, but so mostly what I have is a bunch of questions. So how are you going to be reporting on these results, and what do they represent? Are we going to have tables that are just representing common space, because you're essentially already representing housing units in the existing study? Are we going to have a report that says, here's what multifamily buildings look like in their entirety, tenant and common space? A lot of people, I think, would find that to be of interest. Do we want to, and is it possible to slice out the commercial space when we do that? Because the commercial space in these predominantly residential buildings is not covered anywhere else. It's not part of CBEX. CBEX only covers things that are mostly commercial. And so what's still missing? This is always an issue. We're kind of chipping away at the gaps, but what will still be left missing, we just want to be clear about that. And then I was just wondering, because there was a comment in the study that some of the building respondents complained about the length of the survey, even though it was, I think, about 20 minutes. Are there things that you could actually get out of household respondents rather than trying to get them out of the common area responded, even though they're common area information. And that might be things like laundry facilities and lighting use in hallways or something. And then it wasn't clear whether you would want to be nesting the household sample within the building sample. So pick a building and then you're going to interview 3 housing units as well as the building manager. That's something we've tried to do in some of our surveys. It does give a more robust total picture of a building when you get all of it. But it also means that you've got buildings with only the building survey and buildings with only the household survey and buildings with both. And as you indicated, it does go back to having a more clustered sample, obviously, when we're doing building level surveys. But then I'm also wondering whether some of these methods have application also for the smaller multifamily units. Obviously, it's fewer units, and the common space is less huge, but perhaps consideration. And I think, yeah, that's all I had. So let's see, we've got a few minutes before we break. And let's see, am I stop sharing? Looks to me like I'm still in share mode.
Yes, you are. You are still sharing.
How do I unshare? Click to stop. Okay, there we go. Thanks. Okay. Other comments from the committee? We've got a couple of minutes. And if not, I'll give Chip a chance to make any responses he'd like to. Tom, did you want to say?
I was just going to mention, you mentioned the non-response bias analysis, and one of the things that we found useful is looking at the strength of the weighting variables, variables used in weighting with respect to the outcome statistics, and running simple like regressions involving the weighting variables predict the outcome statistics, and just review measures like the R-squared and how powerful those are and related. And so if they are good and strong variables, then that basically implies that you've done pretty well with reducing bias due to non-response. So that's an analysis type that doesn't involve external data.
Yeah, thank you. That's a nice idea. Other thoughts from the committee?
I'll also make a kind of a quick general comment, which is, if you know ahead of time that what you're going to do is small area estimation, you might design your sample differently than if you're saying, I want to get a sample size that's big enough to get estimates at the right level, and then after the fact say, well, it didn't work, and now I'm going to do small area estimation. So you can be a little smarter about it, in particular to make sure you have data everywhere in the small areas. And it might not make any difference, but in some cases it will. So in other words, if you know you're going to be modeling, design your sample so that you're going to have good coverage for your model and the right variables for your model, rather than treating it kind of an afterthought and designing based only on direct estimation.
Can I follow up with a question on that? So can you maybe compare and contrast the advantages of having just a larger sample overall versus having, maybe, selected oversampling of certain local areas, right? So, American Housing Survey does metro area samples, every other year, right? What are the advantages, disadvantages of those two options? We would love to have a sample of 100,000, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, so if your sample size is not an issue, just go for it, right? But if it is, we have to think of
let's assume it is.
You're going to be fitting a regression model, so therefore you want to have good coverage over your, I don't know what to call it exactly, but your covariate space, right? So that you avoid bad regression outcomes like influential points or things like that. So you want to control more on both X and Y that you're going to be modeling, rather than just making sure you have enough Y. And so you might end up spreading it more equally across your potential covariate space. So you think ahead of time of what that will look like. And this is all very vague. It's just you're thinking differently about your data. You're going to be fitting regression models rather than computing tables of estimates. And maybe it's the same thing, and maybe it's not the same thing. But it's definitely worth knowing ahead of time which of the two you're going to do.
Nice point. Thank you.
you.
All right, with that, we are at time.